everybody. Super excited to be here, and thank you for asking questions, Annie. Like, by all means, if you have questions, I'm more than happy to stop. Let's answer some questions. If some questions are quote unquote out of scope, which might mean it might need a little bit more data or it's a little bit too much of a tangent, I'll let you know. But we could totally chat afterwards. I'm more than happy to talk with people and share the knowledge. So, welcome everybody for the technical interviewing technique session, where we're going to be talking about some techniques and tips and resources in regards to once you do get an interview, potentially how you could support yourself and have a little bit of a guide. So, like Katie mentioned, I'm Jessica. I am a developer, I'm an educator, I'm an advocate in tech. I've been in tech for about 8 years. I did pivot into tech after 10 years of working in the nonprofit space. I went to a software boot camp. I actually taught at that software boot camp, and that's how I discovered Girl Develop It, where I became a TA and then an instructor, and I was teaching for a few years. The last 5 years, I've been a developer relations engineer for Google, working on Google Assistant and Android for cars. And I was part of the Google layoffs in January. So, totally feel ya if you're looking for work. Sometimes it can feel a little overwhelming. And this is why I thought it was really important to just give a little bit of to share the things I do as I've learned over the years. And of course, it's very different prepping for interviews versus delivering interviews. So I ran a few interviews at different companies as well. And so I learned a lot of things that like I look for and other people look for. Like there's a lot of trainings, especially within Google, on how to be a good interviewer. And so definitely want to share a lot of those insights with you all because these are the things people are looking for outside of just getting code that works and solving the problem. So again, I'm Jessica. Feel free to connect with me. I am fairly active on a lot of platforms, and I'm more than happy to connect with everybody. So today's agenda is a little simple, which is great, but also a lot of information. So the first thing we're going to talk about is different resources to help prep for the interview. So I know there's so many resources out there, and it's hard to kind of figure out which ones are ideal or which ones to use. So I have a list of resources to help you prep. Then we're going to go into the 7-step process for the actual technical whiteboarding. Though now we don't do whiteboarding like we used to before the pandemic. So I've modified this to be virtual friendly and pretty much how I've been interviewing as well. And then at the end, I'll have tips and resources, and hopefully we'll have some time if you have any questions as well. So this page is really big. Oh, I forgot to mention, uh, feel free to go to the link bit.ly/tech interview skills. That takes you to the slide deck. So you don't have to copy paste everything or do screenshots. You don't have to write everything down or take screenshots. You have access to all of the links and all the resources. So these are a few links and different resources. And I have a little bit of a blurb about what each resource kind of does and what they're kind of good at. So, of course, the first one, Girl Develop It, does have interview classes. We have several of them. I don't think we have any published for this next month, but we do have them. If you click on that link, it'll give you the list of all the different whiteboarding classes we've had before. But that's one that I would definitely recommend because it is in person, virtually in person, but it's live. That's what I meant. And then there's other resources like Interview Cake, there where they give you. Actually, I've had this. I think I signed up for them back in 2016, and I still get every week. I get emailed from them going, "Here's a question for free." So I've actually collected questions over the years, which is really great. There's also Interview.io, which has recordings of people going through interviews. And that sometimes could be really helpful because you can see the different techniques people do. There's LeetCode, which is really popular, it gives you questions and solutions. Code Signal, same thing, questions and solutions. Interview.school has a comprehensive guide as well. It's all written. PRAMP, PRAMP, is for anonymous peer-to-peer interviewing if you want to do that. Then there's educate.io, which has education and assessments. And then HackerRank, which also has questions and answers. And it has also an interview prep kit too. So lots of great resources out there. And then I found even more resources, but this is specific for system design. So if you're interested in system design or interested in that, there is the book and then 2 websites that are really great when it comes to system design questions um, and educational material. And then if you're a front end person, which I'm not in all transparency, I'm more of a back end person. I'm a Python person. So one of my former students that I had when I used to teach at Hackbright, she was interviewing last year and created this whole guide about front end engineering study guide. So she has tons of resources. She walks through the whole process, which was fantastic. Okay, it looks like Amber has a question. Any thoughts on which are good value? I'm familiar with most of these, but can't figure out if the not free ones are worth the money, especially since some cost rather more than others. I hear you, Amber, and this is where I think it's tricky. I don't think I could go, this is the one for everybody because everyone learns slightly different. So I definitely recommend do their free version of it, get a feel of it. And honestly, if it makes sense to you and you're like, cool, the way they have the structure, I get it and I'm learning something, then you could stick with that. You don't have to test them all out to try to find the best one. If you once you find something that kind of works for you, you could definitely stop there and just, use that service, figure out and just continue with that without having to test them all because I know there's so many. And this is why I want to give you like a reduced version of all the resources. This is the ones that I have found to be the most valuable from several different people. I know if you just give me a list of questions like leak code, it's not my jam for me personally. I don't really care for it because I don't like how it's structured, but I do like all the questions. And so I'm cool with just going somewhere else to get questions and answer. Something I really value is having a person ask me the questions out loud. And that's the part that I'm like, oh, I will pay for that part. So um, I think that's a personal question, but I think any of these you're going to do more than fine. And I'm sorry that that's not like a very clear, this is number one answer, but that's also because I don't want to say something is that when it might not fit your style. But if you want to chat individually, we could totally talk through them all and figure out what your style is, and we can kind of try to narrow that down independently. Cool. Thanks, Amber, for that question. So those are the resources. And sure, and they are agreed a little different from one another. Yeah, sorry. It's they're slightly different. So I think try the free ones and then see what makes sense for your learning and the way that you can the way that makes sense for you. And it has like the languages that you want to study in. I think those are the things you can prioritize. Cool. Okay. So now let us jump into the meat and potatoes of this session. So there are 7 steps that I use and I've recommended to folks. And this is kind of my guiding light. The when you I don't know if you're all familiar with bowling, but for me it's like my gutter rails. It's a way to make sure that when I throw the ball down the bowling lane, I can at least not get a gutter ball. Because this will give me some structure so that I can walk through the interview independent of my anxiety, my nerves. Do I know even the answer to the question? Like it helps to kind of go, okay, cool. If I just do one step at a time, it breaks the problem down to smaller pieces and can make it a little easier to go through interviews, especially your first couple of them. Those could be a little nerve wracking. So these are the 7 steps. Uh, Potentially could seem like, yeah, obvious for some people, but honestly, being able to have it written down where you're like, okay, do this step, then this step, then this step can really help organize yourself. So the first one, restate the question. Then use test cases, draw it out, pseudocode, test, code, and refactor. So I'm not going to just tell you, do these things, good luck. Let's actually walk through it and I'll demonstrate a way that I would handle this and using this as my template. So in years past, I usually present this content with a co-presenter and usually we would interview each other. So I'm going to just interview myself. But the interview begins. So the question I have is, write a method that determines if 2 words are anagrams. Cool. They give me that. Okay. The first step, restate the question. Okay, cool. So you're going to give me 2 inputs and they're going to be strings. And I need to make sure if they're anagrams. And anagrams, let me just make sure. Anagrams are the ones that the strings have the same number of letters, but they could potentially be in a different order. So is that what it is? Generally, the interviewer will be like yes or no, or sometimes it could get a little, at least for me, my anxiety and my nerves get to me, and sometimes I don't hear as well. So by restating it, I can make sure, cool, I know exactly what they're asking. Okay, then I can move over to our use cases or test cases. And this is where follow-up questions are really great here too. Okay, so if I have 8 and eat, that should give me true, right? And this is where you also ask, okay, do I care about capital letters? What about a single letter word? Or is there going to be use cases or times where the input will be nothing? And so you're going to want to walk through potentially the different ones. So, okay, ack and cat should be true. And you always want to include in your test cases a false. So dog and cat should give me false. Okay, great. And then I'm just for clarity, I'm going to ask my interview, okay, so if I have 2 empty strings because that's a potential, that should give me true, correct? Cool. And then you can confirm. And this also makes sure that you understand what the question is as well. So it's a great time to actually sit down and mark those things out. Then the next step is to draw it out. With whiteboarding, it could be a little easier because you can actually like draw on the whiteboard. But I understand that, we don't necessarily have that. We're all going to do all this virtually. So this is the way I would whiteboard it. Be like, okay, so what I'm thinking about doing is, for the first example, I want to get each letter and put it into a dictionary. And then every time that letter is in there, I'm going to have the value increment by 1. So if there was 2 A's, the A key would have the value of 2. But for this example, everything is 1 value. So I'm going to do that for the first word. And what I'm thinking is, for the second word, I'm going to decrement. So I'm going to remove one of the values. I'm going to remove by 1. That way, if I just did that for these 2, my second word would be E is -1. But what I'm thinking is, I'm going to do these 2 sets at the same time. So I'm going to do, not the same time, I'm going to first do the first word, and that's going to leave me with all the 1s. And then I'm going to iterate over the second word, and that should leave me with all 0s because I'm decrementing by 1. Then what I could do after I have processed those 2 strings is, with this new dictionary, I'm going to just check to see if all the values are 0. That's kind of what I'm thinking. So this is my visual. This is how I'm drawing it out, so then my interviewer could know what I'm thinking about. And they could also tell me whether I'm on the right track or if I'm not. So this is like an easy win as well. Cool. So from there, I would pseudocode. So the next step, pseudocode. Okay, so I'm going to call it a counter dictionary. So here's my counter dictionary that I'm going to have. And then from there, I'm going to loop over the first word. And in that loop, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add for every letter as a key and then the value of 1. And of course, if there is that word or that letter in there, I'll add it by 1. Then the next step I'll do is I'll loop over word 2. And if the letter is not in the counter dictionary, then I know it's false. I can return false and do an easy win. And if it is in there, I'm going to subtract by 1. Then I'm going to loop over that counter dictionary and then check the values. And if any of them are not 0, it's a false. And then of course, if I iterate all of them and they're all 0s, then I could return true. So this is what I have so far. So the next step is to test. Now that I have some pseudocode down there, I'm going to test out my pseudocode. And what I normally do is I like to keep track of what my variables are. And so I usually do a table like this on the side. And then usually that's with the whiteboarding. You could definitely do this inline in the text editor, because I'm presenting on kind of a smaller screen. I want to put everything here, so that's why I have it off there to the right. There's my variable and my value. And so my function will start off with word 1, that's the first word, will be 8. Second word, eat. Then, so I have I'm going to initiate the counter. So now I've counter initiated. I'm going to loop over word 1, adding in each letter. So A, then I do :1 because I've added that to counter. And then I do T, add that to the counter, E, add that to the counter. So now I have a visual representation of current state based off of where I am in my code. Now I'm going to loop over word 2. Okay. So if the letter is not on the counter, it'll be false. Is E in there? Yes, it is. So I'm going to get the E and I'm going to subtract E by 1. So now E is 0. And you know what? I just realized something. And this happens a lot where you're like, oh crap, I just realized I could do something else different. This is where what I do is I go, okay, hold on, interviewer. Let me just write this really quickly. I'll just write a comment within my pseudocode. Don't forget about this. And then I keep going with what I was doing. That way I finish my process, double checking what I'm doing. Then I go back and update that new thought I just had. It's like, okay, is A in there? Yes, it is. Let's subtract it by 1. Next letter is T. T is in there. So if it's in there, I'm going to subtract it by 1. So that leaves me at 0. I've iterated the whole loop. So now I'm going to iterate over our counter. So I'm going to check if it's 0. Everything is, they're all zeros. So I'm going to check A and then T and then E. And then they're all zeros. So the next line is return true. Cool. So that should work. My pseudocode works. But I did have an idea. So let me talk to you a little bit about this idea that I want to include. I want to add a check of the length of the string. So if the word 1 and word 2, if the length of the strings are not the same, I know immediately they can't be anagrams. So I'm going to add that. So I'm going to compare the length of the strings. So I can actually pseudocode that in. And if they don't match, it'll return false. Naturally, what I would do next is actually walk through the false use case to make sure that my falses are actually capturing the false scenarios. We're not going to do that today because that's a lot. And I want to make sure we have enough time to actually be able to ask questions and get more depth. But I would walk through it. This would end up with dog having all 1s. And then once I get to the cat, as I'm iterating over here, it would false right here at the if letter not encounter, it'll be false. Cool. So now that I've tested my pseudocode, I have something that I know is going to work. It's going to work in theory. And then this is where you would code is next. Sometimes, and this has happened to me quite a few times, where sometimes my pseudocode is enough and they're like, cool, you know what you're doing. The rest is syntax, which is fine. And it's happened to me where they're like, yeah, no, you don't have to. Your pseudocode has enough. You've tested it. We know it works. That's great. That doesn't happen all the time. But what I like to do is go, cool, this is my pseudocode. This works. And let me give you the time complexity and space complexity, because that's, I feel comfortable and I know how to read this to do that. Not everyone does, but I would end it with that of like, okay, the time complexity for this would be n and space is n. Cool. Do you want me to code this up? Sometimes they say yes, sometimes they say no. Let's pretend they say yes. So this is my code. I pretended to type it up. And what's really nice is this pseudocode is your map. And so with the pseudocode, you could write your code pretty much verbatim almost. You might get some off by 1 errors because it happens, and some syntax things, but that's okay. So here I have it in Python where I have my function. Oh, excuse me, let me just mute myself so I'm not. Oh, so sorry. I was talking so much, I got very excited. Okay, so here's my code. I'm iterating through my letters, and then I'm having some checks, and then I am making sure things work. So it's pretty much almost the same as my pseudocode, which is great. So you could definitely code that up. And then what you want to do, anytime you coded it, then you want to test it again. So I would do the same thing. I would walk through one of the use cases. And this is why it's so important to have your test cases, because then you could use those. You're not having to think, oh crap, what would be a good use case? You have them already. So I would use those use cases and test out your code again. Then after that is always refactoring. And with factoring, you don't have to actually factor it there. You could talk about it. So here I might go, you know what? I think that instead of doing all this, what I could have done is use the built-in method of Python to sort. And then I could have sorted the words and actually do a comparison with them to see if they're the same strings. So that'll be another way I could solve this. And then a different way I could potentially have solved this is actually using Python's counter function, which actually converts them into a dictionary for me and compares it. So Python's actually optimized this whole process. So I think I would do that instead. And you could definitely talk to them about potentially different things without actually having to code them up, which is really nice. But definitely let them know if there are different ways that you could have solved it, to mention it, because they don't know what you do know. So you have to make sure you're proactively letting people know. So that was just me walking through an example of using these steps. Now, let us pivot over to some tips and resources. And actually, before we do that, maybe I should look into the chat. Let's see if there's anything. And looks like Amber's asked, any thoughts on which are a good value? Oh, nope, that's already before. Never mind. Does the string data type in most general purpose languages track the length of the string as a property? Most higher level languages do track the length of the string. So in Python, it's len parentheses, and you pass in the string itself. So it's not OFN. Oh, we could talk about the space and time complexity. It's a little bit outside of the scope, but the complexity is coming from the, let's see, it is coming from the for loops. So the fact that I'm iterating over each letter, that's why I'm touching every element of the string, and that's what's causing it to be N. That's a tangent. And then I've seen that optimization, but wonder if there's any languages where it wouldn't be one to watch out for. And this is where, when it comes to learning the coding, I recommend just learn one language really, really well. That way you know that language, you're not having to worry about others. The nice thing too is if you haven't interviewed before, um, when you're interviewing, you get to tell them what language you're doing. You don't ask them, can I do this Python, or what would you like? You go, I'm doing this in Python. I'm sure, as you notice, I didn't even ask what I'm going to code this in as part of my mock interview. I just did it because that gives me control. And honestly, if they told me do this in JavaScript, I know I'm not going to be as strong in it as my Python. So I usually default Python. For me, is my language. It's my go-to. So don't even give the option. And you can do that as well. Another thing too, I've actually had interviews where they expected me to do JavaScript, and I went, "Thanks, I haven't studied my JavaScript. I'll try to work this out. But you know what? My pseudocode is generally great, but then my syntax I'm not as strong in it." And I actually had an interview not that long ago where I forgot how to write a for loop in JavaScript. A little embarrassing, but I totally forgot. But my pseudocode was good, and they're like, "Yeah, you know what you're doing. You just forgot the syntax. That's okay." So definitely don't feel too bad if you forget something, because it happens to all of us, and that's why we have Google to figure out the syntax portion of it. Okay, so it looks like that was all the questions we have. So now tips and resources. So getting stuck happens. I want to make sure if this happens to you, it happens to everybody, it will happen. And that's okay. And this is where I have a few tips on what to do when you do get stuck. So my very first thing is, when you get stuck, generally what happens to most people is we start thinking, oh crap, I did this and not anymore. And you're thinking to yourself, your interviewer has no idea what's happening in your brain and your mind, and that you are stuck. They don't know. So something that's really great to do is to show your communication skills. And that is what I usually do. Instead of being like, oh crap, I don't know, I think I messed up, or saying something that might be a little negative towards myself, what I do, and this has taken me a long time to practice, I go, oh, this is an interesting problem. Ooh. And I try to treat it as something fun, and like, oh, I didn't think about this. And then what I do is I explain to my interviewer what I'm stuck about. I'm like, oh, I assumed X, Y, Z, and you know what? That assumption didn't work. And usually by doing that, I unstick myself, which is a form of rubber ducking, which just pretty much means when you're trying to explain the problem, you end up solving the problem on your own. And that usually helps me. And that actually makes me feel better when I go, oh, interesting. You know what? And I bring them in on a little secret of like, you know what? XYZ, I thought this, but you know what? Not this. Actually, now I'm thinking I'm going to do this thing instead. It's a it's a slight shift on the way you communicate, but it's uh, gives the impression that potentially you know more, even though you know the same, whether you went, oh crap, or oh, that's interesting. It gives the illusion that you're more comfortable. And sometimes we do need to fake the funk. I know for me, I sometimes do. And that helps just to give me a go-to saying so I don't have to think about how do I present to myself to the interviewer. I have my go-to, ooh, interesting. Let's see. And I try to make it like, this is playful. Because then it gets me into a nice playful state too, versus, oh my gosh, melting. And that's because I know myself and that's how I react. So that's something I definitely recommend. Another thing too, even though you're doing something virtually, if you have if they could see you, I have done it where I get a pen and paper on my own and then I draw it facing the paper to the person. Like, this is what I'm thinking because I'm a very visual person. I need that type of drawing for my own learning. And this is how, when I'm solving problems in the real world, what I do, anyways, I draw it out. And so I'll get a piece of paper and draw it out and just show it to them too. So you could definitely draw it out to help unstuck yourself. And then, you know what? Worst case scenario is you go, I've got myself so tangled up, I'm not sure. Let me start from scratch. And that could be a really hard thing to do, but sometimes that's what you need. Sometimes you need to go, you know what? Let me stop. Let me go back to my pseudocode. I know my pseudocode worked. So let me just scratch all this code, start from scratch, and that could help reset your brain. And that's what's really nice about having all of these steps because they kind of build onto another. By making these use cases, you have your desired outcomes. By drawing it out, I kind of have a map of where I'm going. And then my pseudocode is a more lengthy map of that drawing. And then my code is the solution from my pseudocode. So I'm kind of slowly solving the problem and getting more, the complexities get bigger as I'm going along. And then what's really nice is you're testing it as you're going along. You could just revert back to, you know what, let me go back to my pseudocode. I know that worked. Scratch the code, start again, we move on. So this is I really like the the steps because they really help me walk through it. So let me go back to that other slide. So those are the 4 kind of steps I have or suggestions when it comes to getting stuck. Danielle says a lot of time when I'm stuck, it's because I have a brain freeze from anxiety. Ooh, yeah. So I don't even know what I'm stuck on. I just can't think anymore. Do you have any tips for that? Both what you say out loud and also when you get, by all means, this is again where if you kind of your brain goes blank, that happens to everybody. And not to everybody, but it happens a lot. It's not uncommon. Maybe let me phrase it that way. It's not uncommon. And honestly, too, especially for interviews at like bigger companies, I've noticed this more because people are really excited to work at big companies, or um, because it's a big company, there's a lot of extra pressure we put onto ourselves because of that. Again, this is where I would go, whoa, whew, hold on. You know what? I'm really excited about this, but I got a little overwhelmed and I'm transparent. I usually, you know what? I got a little overwhelmed and let me just take a moment, take a deep breath. Cool. Okay. I'm just really excited for this. And I find this to be really interesting. And that would be my go-to saying. So let me go back from the top and then try to explain whatever I already have to myself, but I'm explaining to the interviewer. But I would own it. Be like, you know what? I blacked out. That's okay. Let me actually take a deep breath. Take my deep breath. So let's start again from the top of wherever step I'm in, and then try to work through to try to figure out where I was as well. So that's something I would do. And again, um, actually, I don't think I was explicit on this. Usually, by the time you're in the interview phase, the interviewers want you to succeed. You've already passed a couple of other steps, so they're hoping that you're going to do great because they want to hire somebody. So they're usually like rooting for you in a sense. So if you get the anxiety, if you're nervous, if you need to be like, oh, hold on, let me just do whatever helps your body regulate the anxiety. It's okay to let people know because they've been like have had anxiety, been nervous. So I would own it versus trying to mask it and try to avoid it, because honestly, that's who you are, and it's better to be upfront with it. Of like, yeah, I get nervous, and that's okay. And the fact that you can move on from there, I think, is really great when it comes to just acknowledging if you're overwhelmed. Cool. Okay, so I'm going to move over to handy tips. These are a few things I would recommend. Generally, when I was doing this whiteboarding class with another person, we usually try to highlight this in the interview, but it's a little hard when I'm interviewing myself. So, something I recommend is to use built in methods. So, if there's a method that already exists within that programming class or language, use it. Unless, of course, that is the question. So if the question is like, hey, write an algorithm to sort something, I wouldn't do Python sorted method because that's what they're trying to test me on. But generally, if they're asking for multiple, there's a couple of steps, you could use built-in methods. That's A-okay. So you could definitely do that. And if they want you to see that work, like they want you to actually build it out, they'll let you know, hey, can you actually write that part out? You're like, yeah, sure. So that's one tip. Use built-in methods whenever you know of it. And also, this is something I do a lot. In Python, there is sort and sorted. One sorts in place, and the other one returns back a new string or array, new collection that is sorted. And so what I usually do whenever it's a sort thing that I'm doing, I go, ooh, I know Python has two, and then I explain the two things. Oh, and for this one, I'm going to use this. And so even though I'm using a built-in method, I throw out the things I do know, like, oh, I know Python does this. And I know under the hood, it's actually n log n when it comes to Python's default sorting. And I just kind of sprinkle in things that I know as I'm being interviewed. So you could definitely do that because that's just extra credit in that sense. So definitely feel free to use that. Another thing that you could do is create your own helper methods. Do not feel like you have to solve everything within one function. You could break it down, and it's called in computer science decomposition, where you break down problems to smaller problems and have different functions. And so you could use helper functions. The most common one that I usually tell people you could totally do and don't worry about it is called clean data function. So you made up a function and it cleans the data. That way, if they tell you, you know what, the sometimes there might be, especially for the algorithm or the anagrams one, there might be letters, or you know what, they're not all capitalized. Then you can go, you know what, instead of having to clean all the data, you could, and then this function cleans the data, and then you can make an assumption that it's done and clean, and now all the letters are lowercase. So you could definitely do that. Generally, they won't actually ask you to code it in after the fact, which is really nice too. So you save yourself a little bit of time as well. But there are other scenarios where creating a different function that will just process data that's not part of the core problem is more than okay to do. So that's another recommendation. And then, of course, share what you do know. So this is where you want to highlight all the information that you might know that might not be strictly applicable, but you could just sprinkle in. So yeah, that example of sorted and sort, I just sprinkle that in, and then I go, oh yeah, I know the runtime is n log n. I don't make it, I just blah, 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 and I move on. That usually means that what I've seen people do after as an interview, they start writing that down. Like, oh, she said this. So anytime you can, just sprinkle in a little information that you might know about the programming language or the way you would do something, feel free to do that because they don't know what you know. And by doing that, you can definitely get extra points in that sense. Okay, I'm done with the slides. So let me go back to the chat and see what we have. Labeling. Not really sure what that means, but I'm hoping that's a good thing. And then Nicole says, also, if someone is not okay with me being human, I don't. Nicole, okay, so for the people on the recording, Nicole said, also, if someone is not okay with me being human, I don't want to work for them. As cool as a job may sound to me, I agree. I usually try to frame things like that. You know what? I don't want to work with people who are a-holes. I don't want to work with people who are misogynistic or ableist or no, if they if they don't want to work with me, this is a great filter. Thank you for saving me a year of frustration. I'm going to go to the next thing. So I really like that, Nicole. Amber says, I have found that interviewers, for whatever reason, especially guys, perceive silence as confused or crying or for help. They expect me by talking through the entirety of the interview, but I can't talk and think at the same time. I try to ask for moments of silence to concentrate, but when I'm able to get, but when I, but when I'm able, when I have been able to get feedback, it's always about that. They feel like they need me to be telling them the whole time what I'm doing. Is this something you've experienced? Any strategies? Oh, when it comes to talking, and it's hard to talk and do at the same time. I think being upfront, the way that you're saying it is great, and it could potentially mean that maybe you just need to section off your problems instead of sitting trying to solve everything at the same time. You can portion it out, and I think honestly, too, the 7 steps might be actually really helpful. So then you're solving the problems small pieces at a time, and you could check in with your interviewer. That actually might be a technique that might help. So then you're still following your logic and you can think things through, but then check in with your person. It is something that you'll need to balance out. And then, of course, it's okay if people go, you know what, I wish you talked a little more. And that's okay. That you don't have to be um, perfect or do what everyone asks. Do what makes sense for you, but still be cognizant that like their interviewer needs to know what you're thinking so they could follow along. So if you are making those check-ins and keeping them up to date, they might want more, and that's okay. You don't have to talk continuously because I don't think that's realistic either. So I say keep doing what you're doing. Jessica says, I've only done mock interviews, and even those are scary. I hear you. Yeah, those could be, even interviewing is scary because honestly, it's you're having someone judge you in a very weird way with a question that doesn't might not reflect your true intelligence. It's a weird setup. It's not a great way to evaluate people. So I agree with you, Jessica. Danielle, in the past, I've acknowledged that I'm nervous and frozen from anxiety, but I've never thought to put a positive spin. Yeah, I'm all about reframing. Oh, I think I mentioned I worked in nonprofit for 10 years before. I worked in mental health for 5 of those years. So I have definitely used my anxiety as a way to get me going. And I welcome my anxiety. I'm like, you know what? You're here because I care and I want to be successful, and that's okay. And so I try to play with my anxiety playfully. And then, I just meant labeling the emotions you're feeling. Yeah, and you can be honest. Be honest with people. I'm in there a little nervous. I'm excited for this role, and that honestly also conveys, that you're interested. You want to. So it's not a bad thing. Okay, so those are some of the handy tips. And now, where's my notes? There it is. Okay, so some important things. The important things when it comes to the interview from interviewers. One is talking through your process, which does not mean you talk all the time, but talking through the process, bringing them along. Think of them as like, this is how I think of it. Honestly, I think of them as students. I go, you know what? Let me teach my students. Let me walk and hold their hand as I'm going through this. Because one, it gives me kind of more control and influence in my own brain. And then two, it puts me in a different mode. I'm in teacher mode. This is not a competition. This is not them judging. I'm here to educate them. And that helps me. But again, everyone's kind of a little different, but making sure that you talk about your process is really important. Something else that's important is having clear pseudocode. So making sure if you're following the step, your pseudocode makes sense and it's clear. Python needs indentions, and so I even did that as well. So making sure your pseudocode is readable to other people. Asking good questions is, oh my gosh, the most important part because it really helps to show that you know how to think critically. And honestly, too, once you get out of the like entry level question, like roles, the questions become purposely more vague because they want to know how would you ask questions and how would you think about things. Because part of being someone who's not a junior engineer is when you're working, someone might give you a problem to solve and like build out this feature, but we need to scope it out and know what questions to ask. So this is a way to ask or to model that when it becomes a not junior interview. So asking good questions. And even if it is a junior interview, or not junior, entry level interview. If it's not an entry level interview, that's why they're asking vague, they give you a vague prompt. But even if it is an entry level interview, the fact that you're practicing those good questions is a really great indicator for hiring managers and interviewers of like, okay, this person is going to think about what are the different conditions that potentially the data might be in. It's really important at least to get something on the board, something written, even if it's not, even if it's brute force, which means it is not the most efficient code. Even if the code doesn't always work for all the use cases, getting something written down is really important. That I think just shows that you're trying and that you're trying to get through things. There are scenarios and situations where because of timing, because the interviewer didn't manage the time well, you don't have enough time to solve everything. So getting something, even though you only have 5 minutes left, you're like, I know I'm not going to solve this completely. Just try to do and spend up to the last second working on it, and that's okay. And then of course, using helper methods is a great thing to do as well. Now, the least important things when it comes to interviews is solving the problem as quickly as possible. You don't have to worry about like getting the most efficient thing as well. So sometimes writing down whatever makes sense to you, even though it might be not as efficient, writing it down, testing it, making sure it works. Then on step 7 with the refactoring, you can talk about, you know what, that might not be as efficient. And I'm thinking potentially doing it this other way would be efficient. That's when you could do that. So that's really also important, or not as important, having the most efficient thing and then solving it as quickly as possible. There are times where you do need, there might be um, a time lock. Like I know if you're interviewing at Google, if your code isn't working and runnable by the end of it, um, then not an automatic fail, but you're that's part of their requirements is that speed and efficiency. At that point, I feel like those type of interviews are different than just your regular interviews. So you will hear people are like, no, you do need to get something fast and efficient and the best optimal. But those are usually for very competitive roles in that sense. And you don't have to worry about that, especially if you're early on. And then honestly too, you can modify the 7 steps so then you can make it a little time faster. And that's what I did when I interviewed at Google. I just didn't do I kept the draw the picture. I didn't do the pseudocode part because my picture was drawn out enough. And I was like, okay, let me write this part and let me write this part. So I drew it in like the sections. So then I could, like, as I was coding it, it was by the section of it. So I skipped the pseudocode because Google is known that there is a certain time limit and you need working code too. So those are the 2 things that are like the least important. Let's see. Oh, we got someone who's saying hello, getting in the background. Hello. And then we see another comment about system design interviews. Do you happen to have any go-to good questions to ask to get more clarity on vague questions? Usually whenever it comes to receiving input, my go-to ones is it clean code? So if it's strings, will I have capitalization? Will I have other markers? So like any other punctuation points in there too. And again, this is when I would just use my clean code function and it cleans it. So I don't have to worry about that, but that's usually one. I usually make sure I have a test that will turn true or does the thing. And then I usually try to have a test case that should break it. And then I usually try to do either an empty or 0 and then negatives if you have numbers. So negative numbers or zeros. So those are kind of my 5 things I usually ask. I usually create within my test cases so I get answers early on, and that should help. Okay, love the point on helper function. Yeah, helper functions. Oh my goodness, yes. That when I discovered that too, I was like, oh, I don't have to write everything. This is great. And then honestly too, if they're interested in seeing you code out the helper functions, they might, but 9 times out of 10, they don't. Cool. Okay, so I got more info for you all. So let us go ahead. Okay. So when it comes to interviewing, I have a few practicing tips because um, I know when you are, when at least when I'm studying and I'm like, okay, I'm gonna interview soon, which I've been doing that lately. I might get a question and I might mull over it and think about it and then try, I'm working on whatever, like using whatever platform. Um, but that doesn't mimic necessarily how interviews happen. And so my suggestion is to, depending on which type of interviews you're doing, and I would do both too. I would time myself. I'm gonna give myself a 25-minute limit or 45-minute limit, depending on potentially the interview. I would do both. I would do a 25 and then do a stop, take a photo of whatever I had, and then continue on to the 45-minute and then take a photo of what I have there and do a hard limit of like, that's it, just to get used to having some type of time limit. Because generally, they won't give you all day when you're doing it in person. Usually, it's up to 45 minutes. And so, I would recommend to folks to get practice with that because then you also get used to the feeling of like, I didn't finish it. Ugh. And that feeling becomes less kind of potent when you're in doing it for real life. So this way you can kind of practice that feeling of like, that's as far as I got, 45 minutes. Okay. And we move on and let it go. Because it will happen. Granted, the letting go part is easier to be said than to be done. Because I know even after that, usually the next day I'm like, no, I have to solve this and finish it because my own brain won't let it go. But being able to get that feeling of, okay, what does 25 minutes feel like when I'm interviewing? What does 45 minutes feel like when it comes to one question? So that's one tip. Another that I find to be the most invaluable is ideally to have someone say the question because it's different to read it or to have a book or to have a platform, but it's a different thing to have to use your ears to hear someone telling you the question. So whether you have a roommate, a significant other, a friend, you're part of GDI, so you could definitely go on Slack and be like, "Hey, does anyone have time just to read me a question?" And like you can give them the question or a list of questions, and they get a pick from whatever one you want to prep on. But that way you get used to the hearing part. You hear the question. Okay, you can ask your questions of like, okay, what are the use cases? This. And then, of course, you're timing yourself. So you kind of model that behavior that's really happening when you are interviewing for realsies. And then the last tip I have has to do with you've done all that. This is the first two is really about mimicking the interview process. The second one is I highly encourage people just because you solve their problem once in one way. What's a really great skill is okay, I solved it with a dictionary. What would be different if I solved it with a list instead? Or what would be different if I just had booleans and being able to see the trade-offs of like, okay, dictionary does this, a list does that. What if I use a linked list? And you can solve the same problems in multiple ways and it gets your brain kind of thinking in different ways, which is really nice. And then you start noticing, oh, for these type of questions, this data structure is the data structure that is really good with this. These questions, you know what, I don't need dictionaries all the time because this of these use cases. So you start learning a little bit more and deepening your understanding of programming too by solving it in different ways. One of the big reasons too is here's a quote from the internet. A good engineer will solve a difficult problem for you. A great engineer will solve the same problem in multiple ways, explaining the trade-offs of each approach. And this is where the beauty and the art of engineering really shines because there's so many different ways to solve something and you can explore that and be able to use that for a learning tool so that you could see the patterns of okay, questions that have to do with, counting how many letters. Dictionaries are really good because you can use the keys and the values. But there are certain use cases where all you need are flags. So you need one or two variables, and that's all. So definitely one of my tips is to solve it in multiple different ways. It's a great practice too. And you could do that too, where you have the same question being asked and you solved it in 25 minutes. And if you finished it, you could spend the next 20 minutes solving it using a different data structure. So Those are suggestions and tips. Um, I am not the all-powerful knowing person that I know all the things. And so I want to acknowledge that I actually went out to my community to on different social platforms, and I went, "Hey, I'm actually bringing in all of these interview tips, and I would love to know yours." And actually, all these people were so kind, and they're like, "You know what? This is my tip, and here's my tip, and you know what? This resource I found to be really great." And here's Linda, and she's the one who sent me the blog post that she wrote. And so I just want to highlight that when it comes to doing something like this, it's really hard and challenging, and it's not bad or not. Um, it's not something to be shameful about asking for help. I ask for help all the time. And this is where is really great about the tech community and communities like Girl Develop It is you can go be like, hey, I have a question. Can someone help me? And by asking it, worst case is no one says anything. That's the worst case. But honestly, most 9 out of 10, like most of the time, you will get somebody to go, you know what, how about this or how about that? So that's something that I find to be really cool. And a lot of the resources I got from a lot of these folks. And from my teachings at Girl Development from before too. So just wanted to acknowledge there's an amazing community out there in tech. Um, and that's when it comes to presentation, that's what I had. I do want to leave you with this note that there is a lot of growth happening in tech. Well, not necessarily tech. There's a lot of job openings for tech talent in non-tech businesses right now. And so actually, let me mute myself. Thanks. What this means is companies like the Home Depots of the world, the Sephora's of the world, the non kind of tech core businesses, they actually have a lot of job opportunities right now. That's where a lot of opportunities, job roles are that are technical jobs that exist. So don't necessarily narrow down your searches to just the FANG companies, the Facebooks, the Googles, the Metas, the Amazons of the world, because right now, big tech is going through a weird shift. But a lot of jobs are in the non-technical, they're technical roles, but they're in non-technical industries, and then also startups. So that's just something I just wanted to highlight. I know when it comes to interviewing, it can be a little scary, especially with everything happening in the world. But there's jobs, there's roles, and you are needed. Something else I would like to ask is if you have any feedback for me, please give me some feedback. It's at bit.ly / chat that dash feedback as well, because that helps me become a better presenter and then make sure that what I gave you all was helpful too. And even if it wasn't helpful, please let me know. And even if it was, it's good information so that I know I could keep doing this. Cool. Does anyone have any questions? From Home Depot like a month ago that they were looking for entry level front end developers. Yes, the jobs are there. They're just in different spots right now. And that's okay. And what's really nice is you could go work for Home Depot for a while. And then when the economy kind of shifts again and big tech starts hiring again, if you want to go big tech, then you can apply and get in when the jobs are plentiful. So, yeah. And that's actually what I'm doing. I worked at Google, got laid off, and right now I'm like, I'm going to go work at a startup. And actually, I'm actually making a lot more base money too. Uh, so I'm actually got a salary increase by going to a startup, which was really interesting because you think Google, you make more money. Not necessarily. So it totally happens. Okay. Oh, thank you for saying thank you. And then what made you switch from mental health field to tech? Oh, that's a great question. Um, I have my kosher, my nice, softer version of I was helping other people and encourage people to follow their dreams, but I wasn't walking the walk. Uh, and so I had to be honest with myself and figure out what I want to do. And tech was something I was always interested in, but I didn't feel like I could do. But in all transparency, too, it's emotionally exhausting. I had one of my volunteers they completed suicide. And that was where I was like, I can't keep doing this. So it was most fun, fantastic time in my life, but it was also exhausting. So I knew I couldn't do it. And that's when I was like, wait, they'll pay me a lot of money to do tech. And I could kind of do some of the same things, empowering others, educating others, supporting people, acknowledging anxiety and mental health, and that's okay. I found that to be really helpful. Oh, thank you everyone for saying thanks to me in the presentation. Oh, I'm so happy you liked it. Yay. Ooh, more about Home Depot. Love it. Thank you for saying it. Thanks everybody. If you are interested in chatting more or want to do something a little more, I'm more than happy to chat with you too. Girl Develop is a fantastic community. Please ask questions to others. There's so many amazing developers too. Another thing I've had in conversations over the last few weeks, I've had some people go, oh, but I'm so nervous because there's so many great talent also looking for work. And I'm like, yeah, yes, but that great talent, they don't have jobs right now. They're more willing to give you time. So you could definitely be like, hey, person who's laid off, can we chat? Of course, granted, please don't start with laid off person. But you could totally ask people who are also looking for work. They're not your competition in that sense. Like they could totally help you and guide you. And most people are really happy and excited to do that. Granted, not everyone will say yes. Everyone has different circumstances, but yeah, it's totally doable. Yay. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, this community is so great.
Thank you so much, Jessica. So good. As always, your presentations are so insightful and just really authentic and easy to access. So thank you so much for being so real and honest and giving some very digestible, easy to achieve tips in this kind of scary place. You make it fun. So I really do appreciate you. And for all the folks that are still on, we've had an awesome 2 days. This is actually our last session, which is hard to believe. And so we will be sending out a full sort of package of all of the recorded content from each one of our sessions, both yesterday and today. We've also had a lot of folks share their decks, links, and presentations. So we'll make sure that we get that to everyone that has registered as well. So be on the lookout for an email from us. And thank you so much for attending. This is probably one of our most widely participated. Well, it's our first expo, and it really blew it out of the water in terms of what we've been doing. So thank you all, and thank you to our awesome presenters like Jessica. We're really, really lucky to have you.
Thank you, Katie, for organizing this. I know it's a lot to organize. I used to organize events, so I know. Yeah. Definitely please pat on the back, get yourself the drink beverage of your choice.
Right, yes.
Put your feet up if you can.
Yeah.
But thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you so much.
Speak to everybody. Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody. See you soon.